Give me an I. Give me a P. Give me an O. I, P, O. In this week's Bull Profits Daily, I'm about to tell you about a phenomenal opportunity that is unfolding in the stock market right now. And it's all about IPOs. So just as a start, in case you don't know what an IPO is, it stands for Initial Public Offering. And in this week's Bull Profits Daily, I'm going to tell you all about it. I'm going to tell you what they are, why they can generate a stock that can go up by 50, 100, 150% in one day. And third, I'm going to tell you how you can get into IPOs. So let's get started. First, what is an IPO? An IPO is a first-time sale of shares for a previously private company. Just think about any big company that you hear about all the time, Amazon, Google, Tesla. These were all previously private companies. They were funded by rich people, by large institutional money, pension funds, and even the wealth funds of various countries like Norway and Saudi Arabia. And they never had publicly traded shares. In other words, if you wanted to buy a share in these companies before they went IPO, you simply could never do it. And for the vast majority of people, private companies are out of bounds. You simply would have no avenue by which to invest in it. So for very rich people who are very well connected, and they have to be specially qualified as investors, they have to show that they have a lot of money, which means like a worth of over $1 million or more, they can get in at the private level. However, for regular investors like you and me, we get in at the IPO, and every once in a while, the stock market is a great place to get into IPOs, and that is where we are today. In fact, last week, there was an unbelievable IPO, a company called Beyond Meat. That's right, Beyond Meat. This is a company that produces meat essentially by synthesizing it. In other words, instead of having a farm and having to raise a cow and then to slaughter the cow to get the meat, they have come up with a recipe to make meat in quantity, essentially factory-made meat. In other words, the way we make everything else. And this Beyond Meat IPO went up by 163% in one day. That's right, one day. Unbelievable, right? And this gain was the greatest gain in an IPO in nearly 20 years, which is why I believe that it is important for you as an investor to pay attention to these IPOs, because I believe that many of these IPOs are good deals, especially because of what I've been telling you. In other words, there is one group of companies in the stock market that I believe are obsolete and are going to go to zero. And they are going to be replaced by these IPOs that are going to take over entire parts of our economy. So why are IPOs set up sometimes to go up in such huge amounts so quickly? Well, it has to do with two things. First, it's how many shares is the company going to be selling in the IPO? That's really, really important. Because as you might imagine, the fewer shares there are, and if there's a lot of demand, there's going to be a lot of people attracted to it if the second thing is right. What's the second thing? The second thing is price. In other words, if there are a few number of shares and the price is right, now you have the magic of what drives Beyond Meat IPO 163% in one day, and where you have other setups like that. Now, I have a lot of experience with IPOs. I, in fact, invested in Google at the very first IPO, and I did very well, and it taught me that there is a certain recipe to capturing the gains in the IPO market. It's a very unique, very unusual market. And so you really, really have to focus really hard on these small details and make sure you get it just right, because many IPOs are a bad deal. However, the good ones can be like Beyond Meat. They can give you huge gains, and they can give you long-term gains like what you've got in Google or in Amazon, has gone up hundreds of thousands of percent since the IPO. So how can you get in on this IPO madness that is currently going on in the stock market? And if you were a big investor, well, then you would call up Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or Credit Suisse. These are the people that were leading the Beyond Meat IPO. And you'd call them up and say, hey, can I get a few shares? And perhaps if you have several $1 billion, they might give you a few hundred shares, a few thousand shares, because that's the way it works. The big investors that pay Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Credit Suisse big money through brokerages and fees and stuff like that, they get preference. Maybe if you're a super wealthy investor, and maybe if you're Warren Buffett and you were interested, you would get some shares. However, for the regular folks, it's kind of hard to get into, which is why I would tell you that some of the big superstar IPOs, regular investors can't get in, but the smaller ones, and there have been a number of these, PagerDuty, up over 50%, Jumia Technology, up nearly 90%, Zoom Media, up almost 100%. These IPOs fly under the radar, and this is why my publisher and I, we have decided that we think we can put together an unbelievable, a phenomenal publication with incredible research to give you the opportunity that you deserve to get into the IPO market. Because I believe that the IPO market is going to stay hot and continue to generate massive, incredible, phenomenal winners for the next 3 and maybe even 5 years, as the old world of these old companies fades to zero. These new companies are going to come in and take their place and also capture their value, and it's going to make their stocks go up. So that's our Bold Profits Daily for you this week. The IPO market is red hot. You should get in on it. And no, I didn't forget, the way that you can get in is through an ETF. It is the Renaissance Ipo Etf. And this ETF buys pretty much every single IPO that comes through over the last 100 days. So it is an ETF, meaning it owns a lot of all of the IPOs that have come public in the last 100 days, and it holds them for as long as 2 years. Now, of course, you can never get the single exposure to Beyond Meat by just owning the Renaissance Ipo Etf. However, it will give you enough exposure to this market where, if I'm right and the IPO market is going to stay hot for a while, this ETF, which is already up in excess of 33% this year, 33% 2019, almost double the S&P 500. It's going to go up and continue to go up. So that's my Bold Profits Daily for you this week. I'll have another Bold Profits Daily for you next week. Until then, this is Paul saying